I had an introduction for Dr. Tharoor, but I'll skip it now because it's all done.
I think so. In fact, when she said he doesn't need an introduction, I was afraid she'd follow up by saying, but he does need a conclusion.
I'm a journalist who knows little about everything, right? I'm kind of a bit intimidated by the prospect of having conversation with a man who held a record for the fastest PhD in his university. That's true, right?
That's true.
Let's start with where you spend a large part of your career, the United Nations. I read through your account of why you didn't get the post of Secretary General, right? Very diplomatic account it was.
Of course.
But it just left me with a feeling that, that firstly, you were disappointed. Secondly, that it was not enough was done for you, and there was a lot of kind of undercurrent of bureaucratic jealousy and usual government bumbling. Can you tell us something more of what happened? I mean, it was a great missed opportunity.
Having just credited me with giving a diplomatic account, you can't now invite me to be undiplomatic, Aroon. So
you're not a diplomat anymore.
The truth is, the truth is that it's water under the bridge now. It was a long time ago. In fact, alarmingly long, 18 years ago now, and feels like another planet, another life. I think that, there were other priorities for some. There were other priorities for India as well. And I think from the US point of view, it was very clear they didn't really want the kind of Secretary General that they thought I would have been. You know that Mr. Bolton, who was ambassador at that time, wrote a very disloyal memoir in which he actually said he had been instructed by the Secretary of State, we don't want a strong Secretary General. And those were the instructions he had to follow. So given all of that, I think there's no point going over all that ground. I think it was worth trying. Yes, I was disappointed because in a curious sort of way, I persuaded myself that my entire working life had been a preparation for that one job. I was almost uniquely qualified in that I'd done every one of the major areas of the UN in the preceding 29 years. I'd done humanitarian, I'd done public information, I'd done political, I'd done the Security Council, I'd done peacekeeping, and I'd done management and administration running the largest department of the UN. So I sort of thought that, no one could be better qualified. But then some positions are not about qualifications. The choices are made essentially politically, and there are political considerations, and you've got a tiny electorate of just 15 countries, of which 5 have further the right of a veto. It becomes a very different story.
Well, the government could have pushed harder. You say that. You said that. I mean,
one can always look back with this might have been, that might have been. The government at that point was busy negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal. So one could argue they had bigger fish to fry.
Why did you leave the UN in such a cushy job and come back to the rough and tumble of Indian politics?
Well, the truth is that, it was always a rough and tumble when I was at the UN too. It wasn't all that cushy. It was challenging and interesting and wonderful. But I felt that, once I had run for the top job, even though the winner, Ban Ki-moon, was gracious enough to invite me to remain, I just felt it would have been wrong because anything I had done or said or not said would have somehow been used to contrast with what was going on with Mr. Ban. It just didn't seem right. So I did sort of consider it. We mutually agreed on extending me for 1 month while I made up my mind, and then I made up my mind I really should move on. And I think in many ways, it's one of these things where, the Bhagavad Gita tells us, do the right thing irrespective of result. And that's more or less the way I felt at the end of it all. I felt the run was worthwhile, even though the result was grossly disappointing. And now the time had come to do something else. In fact, I spent a good year and a half before tumbling into Indian politics, because I got a consultancy. I was being rather well paid for my speeches in this country. There was a speaker's agency in Washington that represented me. Then I could have led a cushy life. But somehow that wasn't enough. I think at the UN one had the sense of being able to leave one's smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history. And you miss that. You miss that sense of relevance. So when, to my surprise, I was asked whether I'd be interested in contesting the elections, I say to my surprise because I don't come from a political family, and you know how it is in our country. Politics is very much Sonia Gandhi. And not only her. but her party and she personally, I didn't hesitate to say yes. And it was, in fact, in many ways, a decision founded on ignorance. Because I left India at 19 when the voting age was 21. So I hadn't even voted in an election. I had no idea what I was getting into. But I thought, great, an opportunity to represent the people. Let's say yes. And boy, it was tougher than walking through the minefields of Bosnia, I can tell you that.
Why do you think they picked you?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. And in a curious way, the failure to win the UN election had nonetheless witnessed 2 or 3 months of intensive media coverage in India, where something about me seemed to have captured the public imagination. And so there was a sense that this was the moment to, if you like, exploit it, to take advantage of it for the party, because suddenly there was somebody whom apparently large sections of the public were prepared to like. And at the same time, I was game. I wasn't asking to be parachuted into the Rajya Sabha. I was willing to go fight it out and see if I could make my case to the actual voters. And they were prepared to take a chance on me. The particular seat, Thiruvananthapuram, had been lost by our candidate the 2 previous elections. So they didn't have very much to lose. If I lost, I wouldn't be doing anything. I wouldn't be losing a seat we held. And if I won, it'll be a net gain. So why not? That's what happened.
Do you regret it in any way?
No, I've done it now 4 times.
No, when you
which is probably more than I expected to when I first embarked on it. I've had moments of regret. They were, first of all, I was incredibly naive about, not just about not knowing what elections were all about, but I'd been so used to incredibly fawning attention on my visits to India from the UN, both by the media and by the political class, that I had completely overlooked that it would be very different when I had actually come into their game. And I think there was very much a sense that, and one person put it rather evocatively in a conversation with a then friend of mine whose son is sitting here. The conversation said, "Why is this man coming from New York to eat our lunch?" And that was a minister of state in the central government who said that. And I think there was an enormous amount of resentment that I'd just come in and sort of swept. I won a record majority in Thiruvananthapuram, got a huge amount of attention, and a lot of people decided they had to teach me a lesson. And they did.
I mean, your Malayalam wasn't too good. Your Malayalam wasn't too good either.
No, it got better in the course. But what happened was, the tactical mistake, one of the tactical mistakes the commies made was to say that, look, this fellow's Malayalam is not that good. He's been sitting in New York speaking in English all the time. How is he going to represent us? So I would go out and speak to them in Malayalam, and I would say, look, my Malayalam isn't great, but you can see I have enough Malayalam to understand your hopes and your needs. But what is far more relevant, I have the English and the Hindi to express them in Delhi. Speaking fine Malayalam is not going to get you very far in Delhi. And that argument turned out to be quite clinching, so it helped.
Well, let's look at the American elections, which are just less than 2 months away. How do you see it from the Indian perspective? Who would be more beneficial for India, Trump or Kamala or... Can you give us a...
There isn't any other...
what do you think of Trump,
the two of them. Well, look, it's difficult to be completely objective. One has personal preferences, obviously. But I think one could say with some objectivity that it almost doesn't matter to India who wins, because we'll come out of it all right with either side. Which is... It's true. I mean, the fact is that India-US relations have now become bipartisan in both countries. In India, the Congress and the BJP have both been pro-Indo-US relations, and in America, for a number of reasons. Both parties, both buoyed up by all of you, the very strong Indian-American diaspora, have definitely become committed to the basic idea that Indo-US relations are important and worth supporting. And now we've seen Trump as president, we've seen Biden-Harris, and we've actually had no problems or setbacks. Yes, there haven't been any great epiphanies of magnificent major breakthroughs like the Indo-US nuclear deal was once expected to be. But there's a lot happening at the sort of subterranean level. There are working groups on everything from scientific cooperation to nuclear energy to intelligence sharing. All sorts of things are happening. And the people-to-people contact, of course, keeps growing. I think Binay Pradhan, the Consul General, had some telling figures. If every third foreign student in this country is an Indian, that tells you something already. If, as he says, there couldn't be an American in this country who doesn't have an Indian friend, that's pretty telling. So this is all a transformation from the days when I first came to this country 49 years ago as a graduate student, and I was still a fairly exotic creature. And if you met an Indian on the Boston subway in those days, you immediately started talking to each other because you were so rare. I mean, there weren't that many of us around. Today, it's a different story, right?
Yeah, that's true to a point, but I think that Vice President Harris is far more critical of India, especially the human rights aspect of it.
So she's not critical of India. She's far more critical of certain kinds of strains of Indian politics, which don't happen to be mine. So I'm not terribly concerned.
She's got a view on Kashmir too.
No, I mean, I think in many ways, she's an interesting case because she actually did visit India a lot as a child. Even during the election campaign when she was running in the primaries, and of course she didn't make it, but she was doing a lot of Indian stuff. She had a cooking session with Mindy Kaling that was all over YouTube. You must have all seen that, some of you. I mean, she was very comfortable in making her doshas and talking about them, or thosais, as the Tamils would say. She is somebody who in many, many ways is comfortable with Indian culture, recounting her conversations with her grandfather, walking on the beach in Adyar. There is a level of familiarity that one can refer to as affection. Now, that's a good thing for India. Now, within India, of course, I mean, she associates herself with that wing of the Democratic Party for whom human rights is important, for whom diversity is to be celebrated, not to be disparaged, for whom Islamophobia is shameful, all of those things. And when these tendencies manifest themselves in India, she's bound to be critical, as I would be at home and as you ought to be, Aroon.
No, but do you think that she may, because she's Indian, overcorrect herself, that any decision she may take which favors India, people will say, oh, because you're Indian? Is there a possibility of that?
I don't think so, because, no decisions are ever taken by a president on her own or his own. I mean, there's an entire administrative system through which decisions are processed and filtered. So by the time it reaches her desk for signature, it's gone through very many non-Indian hands, believe me. I don't think you have to worry about that.
What do you think about Trump? Can you give us a Tharusic word for him? Without being too diplomatic.
I was going to say uncivilized, but I thought that might not be polite. Look, it's really not our place, especially since I have been introduced as a member of an Indian parliament and so on. I shouldn't be commenting on political leaders in foreign countries on their soil. But having said that, it's also true that people have their political preferences. And mine is not a political preference. I don't pay taxes here, so I don't care if they're lower or higher. I don't, I'm not seeking to be an immigrant here. Even when I had the right to apply, I didn't. And therefore, I'm not worried about their stand on immigration. Those are other issues. On policy issues, everybody in this hall is entitled to their own preferences. But just the personal manner strikes me as not entirely as agreeable or pleasant as one would like to see in a distinguished American political figure. I had the great honor of meeting 4 or 5 American presidents during my time in the US and having detailed conversations with both the Bushes, with Clinton, much more briefly with Obama. I mean, these are people of certain class, a certain distinction, and it's not politics. There are 2 Republicans in that list and 2 Democrats. But there was a certain both political heft, statesman-like gravitas, and intellectual quality that I find woefully lacking in this gentleman. That's the personal reaction.
Your, how should I describe him? Your eminent leader, Rahul Gandhi, has no problem criticizing India sitting in foreign lands. Do you have he's recently made a very what shall I say, controversial comment about the Sardars that they cannot wear a turban, will not be allowed to go into a Gurdwara, and so forth. Have you seen that?
No, I've missed that one. Is that something that happened here?
Yeah, it's happened here. And he said that India is not a fair place, and this is what's going to happen.
Look, I think as the leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi is entitled to take his message wherever he wants to, and I think I certainly would not second-guess his right to do so. I see my role considerably more modestly, and I do believe that we've long had a tradition in our country of saying that our political differences stop at the water's edge. Today, perhaps that seems a little quaint, but we do feel that when we go abroad, we are all Indians first and foremost, and not identified with a particular political cause. Having said that, I think the first person to publicly break that convention was actually Mr. Modi, who attacked all previous governments and prime ministers and even said that people used to come abroad and be ashamed of carrying an Indian passport or being Indian and so on. So a lot of those things that shocked us, which no other leader before Mr. Modi of any political party had done before, I'm afraid the convention ended there. So it's a bit rich to now blame Rahul Gandhi for doing what Mr. Modi has already done.
No, but if somebody's doing something wrong,
Well, I'm not doing it, Aroon, so let's move on.
Okay, but you have to defend your leader. Anyway, you've been a Minister of External Affairs, Minister of State for External Affairs. What is your view of India's foreign policy now, especially in relation to Russia and America in context of the Ukraine war?
Well, you know, on Ukraine, I mean, I'm on the record because I was the only speaker in the Lok Sabha debate to have criticized the Indian government policy on Ukraine. And my reasons were very clear and cogent. I said that we have stood for certain principles in the world for the last 50 years, in fact 70 years really, since the Panchsheel Doctrine was articulated. And those include the respect for the UN Charter, the sovereignty of states, the inviolability of their borders, and the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. And to me, I thought it was shameful that in India's first few speeches of the UN, we failed to articulate any of those principles, of course, did not mention Russia or condemn Russia or use the word invasion or condemn it. But we didn't even articulate the principles we had always stood for, which I thought was unfortunately mealy-mouthed. I do think my criticism hit home because before too long, we did start articulating these principles. But there's still been about 20 abstentions by India at the UN General Assembly in the last 2 years. 2.5 years. And I think it's put us in a position where we have seemed to convey to the world that because Russia is a friend, we can't speak truth to it. And I think that's wrong. I mean, the whole point of friendship is that you should be honest with your friends. You can find ways of doing it. And I'm glad that Mr. Modi in Samarkand actually said, Mr. Putin, this is not an era of war. It's a modest beginning towards pointing out that Mr. Putin shouldn't have started that war and continued it. But now it's also true that India has subsequently managed its stance somewhat adroitly. It is, for example, a very, very major purchaser of Russian oil and gas. So Mr. Modi can rightly turn to the Indian public and say, if you don't like my Russia policy, you're getting cheaper oil and gas because of it. So that's a very fair point he can make.
You agree with that?
I agree with that, and I'll explain to you in a second why it's not just I who agree with it. The fact is that that's part of the argument. I'll come back to it in a minute. There's also the point that he's gone to Ukraine, and I thought that was a very important thing to do. So that he has actually shown India's acceptability to both sides of the divide. That going to Ukraine was particularly important because you remember he went to Moscow and embraced Mr. Putin on the very day that Russian bombs and missiles were falling on a children's hospital, killing children. Yeah. So when he went to Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky took him rather deliberately to a memorial for Ukrainian children killed in the war. But it was, in a sense, a way of expiating. So that was the second point I wanted to make, that India has been more even-handed since my original criticism 2 years ago. But having said all of that, on the Russian oil thing, it's not just India, actually. If you look at the fact, what happens to Russian oil? We actually import more Russian oil and gas than we need for domestic consumption. So what do? We send it off to the world's largest refinery in Jamnagar, where it's refined and processed, and then shipped off and exported to be bought by whom? By Americans and Brits.
Yeah.
So we are actually contributing to stabilizing world oil prices, first because we are essentially not competing for other sources of oil, because we've got the Russians have gone from 4% of our oil supply to 48% of oil supply. So we're no longer that much of oil, otherwise we'd be wanting to buy out of the Saudi Arabians and all the other sources, and that would have driven prices up, and you Americans would have been paying more at the pump if we were doing that. So that's already one contribution. And secondly, we have indirectly helped the Americans and the Brits as well with refined oil.
But the Americans don't appreciate it, it seems. Or they don't realize it.
They haven't been as condemnatory, partially because these two advantages have also occurred to them.
What about China? What is India's approach to China? I mean,
on China,
we're still
honestly,
the largest trading partner still.
It's a very paradoxical policy. Arun, what you've got is a situation where the Chinese have behaved abominably with us on the border. And at the same time, we have allowed our import dependence on them to grow up in that very time. So, since 1976 all the way to 2020, a good period of 44 years, there'd never been a shot fired in anger on the border. There'd never been an incident. I mean, once in a while, soldiers pointing guns at each other. But the deal was, the modus vivendi, I'm putting it very simply, was if we said our border was up to there and the Chinese said their border was up to here, well, we would patrol up to there on Monday and they would patrol up to here on Tuesday, and we wouldn't get in each other's way. And we actually had a very good arrangement where there were 65 patrolling points where both armies would patrol at different times, and they never tripped up. And then what happens? The Chinese era of the peaceful rise is over. Now it's muscular aggrandizement that's happening out of China. And what have the Chinese done? On 26 of these 65 patrolling points have gone and parked themselves. They've started building enduring installations, bunkers, serious heavy ammunition. So this is unacceptable. The first time they started doing this, some of our boys went unarmed, headed by a colonel, to say, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be staying on. Move on. It's our turn to come. And they got pushed off a cliff. Then there were brawl broke out and 20 Indian soldiers died. And this is not a small matter. This is unforgivable.
So what would you do?
Well, I think I would.
What about the trading part of it? I mean,
the trading part of it is precisely what's so shameful. We made a lot of token gestures. We banned TikTok and half a dozen other Chinese apps. But in the meantime, our trade imbalance, which is already pretty bad at $50-odd billion, is now gone up to $100 billion negative for us. The Chinese are just exporting even more to India. And the feeling we have is that the Indian business community has got the BJP government in a bind, that they want to keep on importing the stuff, and the BJP government is allowing them to do so, ostensibly because the Indian economy needs it. But in that case, how do you tell the Chinese, as Mr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, has been saying, we cannot have business as usual? Whereas this is worse than business as usual, right? You're actually giving them lots of your money, your hard-earned money, while they're sitting on your border points.
And no
so
make
to my
in
mind,
India also.
to my mind, this is a policy that would really need to be reviewed. But at the moment, the government is I think, alive to these contradictions, and there've been some strong language coming out of the foreign minister, but the contradiction is still a glaring one.
And Pakistan, do you agree with the stand, no talks till cross-border terrorism stops?
Not fully. I mean, I understand the government's view, and I say this to you very frankly. I believe that the sense of betrayal that Mr. Modi felt after his rather dramatic visit
Nawaz Sharif, too.
when he went to Lahore for Nawaz Sharif's birthday and attended his granddaughter's wedding. And that too, he took an enormous risk because he impulsively agreed to stop over on his way from Kabul at a time when the Indian ambassador in Islamabad didn't have enough physical time to get to Lahore airport. And so he was landing, the Prime Minister of India was landing in a foreign country without the ambassador even there to receive him. And unprecedented. But Mr. Modi took that risk to make that gesture. And he was rewarded, a few weeks later with Pathankot. And then even then he couldn't believe it. He said, no, Mr. Nawaz Sharif would know this. This has happened without the government knowing. And so he invited the Pakistanis to come and inspect the airbase. To the horror of our security community, he said, how can you let the Pakistani intelligence look at your airbase? He said, no, Mr. Nawaz Sharif is different. And what happens? They come, they look around thoroughly, and then they go back and they let it be known through the Pakistani media, oh, the Indians did it to themselves. I mean, do you expect Mr. Modi to ever want to deal with them again?
So you
the
agree
level
with
of mistrust after that, and then you had Uri, Nagrota, there were more and more incidents. And finally, of course, Pulwama before the 2019 election. So I think in all fairness, I cannot fault the Indian government for having set their face very hard against dialogue with Pakistan. But where I can say it is that, okay, so that applies to the government because they're either unable or unwilling to rein in the nasty elements in their military and their militants. And it certainly applies to the military. But why don't we at least open up to people, to popular individual contact? Mm-hmm. Why don't we let businessmen and singers and artists and cricketers who haven't played cricket with Pakistan in each other's country since 2008? And I do believe, I really do believe that there's an enormous amount of scope, short of conceding on points of principle of the government. The irony is we've missed at least one phase when both the Pakistani civilian government and the military were very keen on peace. But at that point, our Indian government said, we don't trust these guys anymore. And you know, many of us got messages.
You don't know who to deal with there, whether the military or the civilian.
I mean, there was that very brief spasm, and both Imran as Prime Minister and Bajwa as the army commander were sending signals through everybody they could find that they were serious about peace. But anyway, we were not receptive.
Do you agree with the abrogation of Article 370? Let's talk a little bit about your Congress party, right? You fought for the you fought for the presidency and lost. What was your motivation there? You didn't have the blessing of the powers that be there.
Well, you know, actually, I fought at a time when the initial impression was that genuinely there was a desire on the part of the Gandhi family to step aside and see a change. And it was only when that was being repeated personally.
You got a signal for that, or or you just thought it?
No, I actually went and saw Mrs. Gandhi.
And she said?
And she said that. And then I went and saw Priyanka and said, did she mean it? And she said, yes. And I went to Rahul. He was already walking, as I'd been walking with him in Kerala for the Bharat Jodo Yatra. And I walked with him some more and asked him specifically this. And he said, yeah, I've been in favor of elections in the party for a very long time. So go ahead and contest. And that's the spirit in which I did. But once I had undertaken to commit, to run, even when it became clear that, in fact, protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, that there was an officially sanctioned candidate with the backing of the entire party establishment, I decided that it would be a cowardly thing to pull out at that point. I knew the result was now foreordained, but I felt that all those who had reposed enough faith in me to nominate me, who had come and conveyed their views to me, many of whom were people who didn't know me before, but who reached out to me because they wanted a voice to express their hopes, their concerns, their grievances. I felt I couldn't let them down.
So why do you think the Gandhis changed their mind?
Look, that you'll have to ask them.
I think, well, they asked you to stand. I mean, you must have asked them, well, what happened?
I didn't. And you know, we can, there's some conversations better not held in a public forum. I think that, you know, as they say, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens inside the political party that you belong to should stay inside the political party you belong to.
Okay, then I've got a signal here to say that, unfortunately, we have to end my conversation and put it out to the audience to see if they want to ask any questions.
Okay.
If you take them in clusters, so that we can get more questions.
All right.
Sure. I'm relieved you didn't ask anything about long words. Long words.
My question is, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies and their role in impacting, you know, sovereign countries' form of fiat currency?
Forgive me, I don't know if it's the acoustics of my stuffy head with the cold.
How about Bitcoins?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin?
What's your opinion on Bitcoins?
Okay.
There was a question here somewhere.
Sanjoy, let's do it one by one. Otherwise, these questions get all muddled up. You just answer that quickly.
Mine is a very harmless question. Is there any new book that you're working on?
Yeah. I mean, I'm supposed to answer all of them in a cluster, right? What you want me to do?
Cluster, or are we doing individual?
All right, okay.
Yeah.
So look, on Bitcoin, I'm a skeptic, but I'm not hostile to it in the sense that I entrust my savings to an investment manager, And I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, when I had to file the affidavit about where all my investments are, that one of his investments is in one Bitcoin. So I own one Bitcoin myself. But I'm a little skeptical because I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe in sort of real value, as a solid asset. And I'm skeptical about something that's created by a computer program and whose price seems to fluctuate like some sort of hyper kids yo-yo. So it's very difficult to be totally upbeat on that. I'm not saying that India should not have some sort of cryptocurrency, but I would be very wary of an entire country. I think there was a country in Latin America that went crypto. Was it Ecuador?
Yeah, El Salvador.
And you know what happened. I mean, it really was a disaster for their economy. So I think we really have to be a little careful about Bitcoin. On the books here, I've got a book that's just come out in India, not yet here, on words, called A Wonderland of Words, which is really just a kind of journey through the joys and pleasures of the English language as I've grown up in India with it. And I'm working on something very different right now. There's a remarkable late 19th, early 20th century spiritual reformer, a lower caste spiritual reformer in Kerala, who I thought deserved to be better known outside Kerala. So I'm working on a short biography of him, Sri Narayana Guru, which is literally, I'm still in the research stage, so it's nowhere near ready to talk about. But I was pleased with the reception that both my short biographies of Nehru and Ambedkar got. And I thought I'll try one more, at least, in the genre before I move on.
Do you do your own research, Shashi? I mean,
Yeah,
because you're very
so for Nehru,
books.
I was still at the UN, did all my own research. For Ambedkar, I did have a couple of people digging up extra
And the
material
British
for me.
Empire, Inglorious Empire,
The Inglorious
that had a lot
Empire
of
was
facts
one
and
where I
figures.
had a full battery of researchers.
Yeah,
with
because it had a lot of
vast
facts and
amount
figures.
Yeah, and I've acknowledged them all in my acknowledgement, so they're not. But as a result, I have the most incredible collection on my hard drive of material on that period of the British Empire, which I might grudgingly share with another researcher, because there's a lot of good stuff there that took a lot of trouble to put together. I actually asked a couple of people to go in and look at, dredge up all the old stuff, but I also got a couple of young people to go and look at the new academic writing. So I was up to speed on what the academics were saying about these subjects as well. So there's a lot there.
How do you find the time to do all this?
I don't. It's a challenge. I just don't sleep enough. It's one of my...
Yeah, any more questions?
Writer.
Hi, this is Jayesh. Dr. Tharoor, it's always great to hear you speak.
Thank you.
So in the recent Indian elections, you saw the results. Do you see it as a result of Congress doing well, or it was more of an anti-incumbency result, or do you see the partnership with the Indi alliance as a result, or something else? What is your
All
view?
of those factors are true. You know, I actually said and wrote at the time, for the BJP, this was a victory that looks like a defeat. And for us, it was a defeat that looks like a victory. We did very much better than we thought, in the sense that I'm proud to say I actually predicted on the record 3 months before the voting even began that BJP would not cross 240. What I got wrong was how well their allies would do. I assumed 20 to 25 of their allies. They ended up with 55, and that gave Mr. Modi the comfortable majority that the NDA now enjoys. But for the first time now in all his years as Prime Minister, his party no longer controls a majority. So that really looks like a defeat, because he lost seats in places like UP, where they really were, before the election, they were boasting they might win 80 out of 80 seats, so at least 78. They had two that were going to go to an ally of theirs. That was the kind of talk they were making, and look what happened. So that was very striking. There was also a certain amount of anti-incumbency, and that too in places they weren't expecting it. There was also a certain renewal of faith in the Congress party. And as you rightly said, there was the great advantage of the alliance, because the truth is that in our country, very often the BJP was winning seats because the majority of the vote was split amongst two or more opposition candidates. Where we were able to eliminate that, we won in many more places. Never forget, and I want to point this out because there are folks in the diaspora here who may not remember this, that the BJP has never even won a majority of the Hindu vote in India. Hindus are 80% of the country. So to have won a majority of the Hindu vote, you need more than 40%. The BJP has never won 40% nationally. They won 31% in 2014. They won 37% in 2019, and they only went down to 36% in 2024. So they've never had a majority, even of the Hindu community, let alone of the national vote. But they were winning a lot because of our first past the post system, where they were 35%, 40%, you'll find that the others have divided the 60% between them, and so you sail through. Where we were able, and it wasn't everywhere, but where we were able to eliminate the risk of that and have just one strong opposition candidate as an alternative, in many cases, people voted for the India Alliance candidate. So every factor you mentioned is valid.
Wasn't the factor, one of the factors was the reservations, the whole issue boomeranged on them, that they're going to go 400 Pas, amend the constitution, eliminate reservation. That's what played in your favor. And Congress really capitalized on it.
Well, their hubris definitely hurt them. You remember they announced at the very beginning that they were going to come back with more than 400 seats in Parliament. Ab ki baar 400 par. And people started asking, why do you need 400? You've been governing fine, doing exactly what you want with 300 and change. Why 400? And then we all said, of course, they want a majority to amend the constitution and create the Hindu Rashtra of their wet dreams. And suddenly, people started saying, oh my gosh, that's what they want to do. And then 2 or 3 BJP candidates who hadn't obviously read the script started saying that, yeah, we need these kind of seats in order to amend the constitution. And we naturally lapped into that and said, what do they want to amend? Maybe they want to take away your reservations. You want that? And of course, a lot of people turned around and said, no, we don't want that. So these were some of the factors that definitely happened.
One of the issues with the Congress party is that, you were the authors of liberalization, right? And now it seems to be that you're moving more towards socialism, right? PSUs are going to provide the employment.
Welfarism, I think, more than
Well,
that.
welfarism, all of you practice, right? It's only what kind of economy do you want? Is it a market economy or a state-driven economy? It seems to me that, Congress always had the kind of socialist, closet socialist, and now they've come out of the closet with Rahul Gandhi, and he wants a much far more socialist kind of way of doing things.
No, the way I'd articulate our policy, and mind you, there'll still be discussions within the party if we ever come to power, but one way that I've expressed it in Parliament, and I'm proud to say Mrs. Gandhi was sitting there and applauded when I said this, was that we do believe in the free market, we do believe in liberalization, but we also believe, unlike the other guys, that the revenues that come from the fruits of this liberalization should be distributed to those who have nothing. That, the magic of the market will not appeal to those who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. So in order to give them a leg up and give them an opportunity to participate in the market, you give them support and welfare and some of the government's revenues. But it's not anti-market, it's actually strengthening the market in the long term, because there'll be more participants who become consumers and customers of the future. That was my logic, and I'll stick to that.
And a perfect place to stop.
Okay, I think...
Okay, there is a lady who's had the mic and has been waiting.
I've
I'm
been
really
given a
sorry
signal.
because we're
Last
so
question,
late.
quickly.
We're really late.
Yeah, last question.
Can we get a
I don't
question
think
in?
it's working. Okay. Dr. Tharoor, Mr. Puri, what an engaging conversation. Thank you. My question to Dr. Tharoor is, in the light of the utter pandemonium the world is in, especially what's happening in the Middle East, Gaza and Israel and so on, what is the relevance of United Nations still?
Oh my word, that's an entire seminar in itself, I'm afraid.
He'll write a book on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vast subject. I mean, the fact is the UN is a forum of governments. They reflect the inequalities of governments, the different stands government takes. When governments agree with each other, the UN is empowered to do a lot. When governments disagree, the UN is less efficient. One cannot discredit the UN by its failures any more than one can glamorize it only by its successes. It's succeeded often enough to win 3 or 4 Nobel Prizes for peace. So it's done a lot of good work. But there are situations in which the UN, being a mirror of the world, reflects the fact that there are countries that don't agree. And when those countries are powerful countries, big countries, superpowers, permanent members of the Security Council, the organization does seem paralyzed. I still feel that more could have been done by, and I'm going to come out on a limb and say this, I've said it already in an op-ed in India, that I remember when Mr. Clinton threatened to bomb Baghdad the first time back in '98, Kofi Annan didn't stand on ceremony. Within 24 hours, he got on a plane and flew to Baghdad to persuade Saddam Hussein to cooperate with the UN weapons inspectors. That was defiant action in the face of the determination of a permanent member of the Security Council. So I don't accept that when the permanent member is determined to do something, that the Secretary General is powerless to act. He was able to buy the Iraqis 8 or 9 months of peace till Saddam again came into a confrontation with the weapons inspectors, and then Mr. Clinton didn't wait and he bombed the place. But the fact is that at least he took that initiative and he brought about some degree of peace at that time. When the Brits and the Americans were shouting from every available rooftop that the Russians were amassing forces to march into Ukraine, from December to February, just read the headlines. Every day there was a statement by some American or some Brit that they have intelligence information, satellite information, Russian troops are amassing, etc. Why didn't the Secretary General get on a plane and go to Moscow and say, what are you doing here? What is your intention? What do you want? And then go to Kyiv and say, look, they seem to be serious. If you want to forestall a war, this is what they want from you. And we can do this without war. Something like that. Mm-hmm. At least the attempt, I believe, could and should have been made. It clearly wasn't, and that, I think, is something that dismays me. But that's the Secretary General. The UN as a whole, the great contradiction with the UN is both an arena or a stage and an actor. The stage is a stage occupied by all the member states. The actor is the Secretary General, or the troops, or the agencies that go out and implement what the member states agree on. And ultimately, what you're seeing in the examples you gave of Gaza and Ukraine and so on, is that member states don't agree, and so the UN has not been as effective as possible. But there will be a crisis coming along down the road next year or somewhere else, where member states do agree, or do agree sufficiently for the UN to make a real difference, and then you won't ask that question anymore. Thank you.